Welcome to what will be our last session for this 6-week journey of imagining new stories of race and religion, religion and race. We've been on this journey. What we did, just kind of summarize where we are. We started off, first we started off in our very first session looking at the recently held Georgia elections, the senatorial elections, and then contraposing those to the protest insurrection that happened the very next day at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and trying to imagine how we could see narratives of race and religion intersecting to shape the behaviors, the thoughts, the reactions in each of those experiences, the planning that led up to them, the organizing for the senatorial campaigns, the nature of those campaigns, and so forth. So that was our first week. And we looked at in real time, because we had the benefit of having a immediate experience to analyze. We looked in real time at the roles of race and religion in world affairs, or at least in US affairs. And then we leaned in more specifically to the notions of narrative and story. And so while the title of the webinar, the title of our series has been Imagining New Stories of Race and Religion, we put that in context with the notion that stories are singular events, whereas what narratives do is they provide a framework that connects many stories. So narratives connect many stories, and they give the framework in which we make meaning, and they create a sense of expectations. In some way, the narratives that we live in, most of which are unconscious, guide our emotional, relational, action, behavioral practices, even when we don't know it. And so we looked, having made that distinction between story and narrative and meta-narrative and archetype, we looked at how religion and how race show up as narratives or create narrative structures, right? And so what they do is religion and different organizing principles, one would call them religion, faith, belief systems. They create the framework in which we make meaning. Often they create framework for ethics and behavior and for legal frameworks and judicial kind of understanding of judgment, who's right, who's wrong. Moral frameworks, if you will, are often embedded in faith propositions in religious systems. And so narratives that connect a bunch of different stories within that realm. And we also looked at the notion of race, recognizing that race itself is a socially constructed, purely fabricated idea, but that racism and ethno-nationalism and ethnocentrism are very real. And so the ethnic and the racial construction is in and of itself a fiction, but the impact, because those were used as a mechanism, as a proxy for distributing value among different humans in different cultural contexts, we looked at the impact that those narratives have. And what happens is the narratives of race and religion share a similar function in that they create understandings of belonging, like who belongs to who belongs within the civil sphere, who is it acceptable to push to the margins in this culture or that. And so we've been looking at the ways in which race and religion shape the civil sphere and how they can create spaces for conflict and exclusion. And then we began considering the possibility of articulating counter narratives when either race is imposed in ways that create marginalization impeding full flourishing, how might we begin to create counter narratives, restructuring of stories in ways that invite more open, inclusive flourishing among people so that people aren't uh, diminished in their value or their possibility by the categorization of race. And similarly, religious, particularly dominant religious narratives, often are used to create space. And so the space itself, the civil space, the public space, is often constructed within the framework of religious narratives. And so when those religious narratives are too constraining, how might we create the possibility of counter narratives to create more open civil space, civil sphere? And what do racial histories do to shape and reshape how people utilize their religious narratives? So this evening, as our last session, we're going to have just a kind of a free-flowing conversation. We've got 4 delightful panelists that are joining us this evening. I'm very excited about that. June Goldstein, John Pinter, Charlie Pine, Mana Derakshani. I hope I didn't completely brutalize this. And so I want to invite our panelists to join us at the moment, and we will begin our conversation. So what I'd like to do is just start and have each of the panelists introduce yourselves briefly, and then we'll start leaning into some conversation.
Hi, I'm June Goldstein, and I'm a member of the Church of Loretto's community here in South Bend, and I also participate in the Dialogue for Women Interfaith group.
Great. Do you want to say just a bit more about the church?
Oh, well, our church community is at St. Mary's College, as Mana probably knows, and we are a group of associated and hosted by the Sisters of the Holy Cross, who are resident at the convent there. Perfect. And it's a lot of families as well as individuals and like-spirited people.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Good afternoon. I'm John Pinter, and I'm a member of St. Joe Catholic Parish here in South Bend. In my professional life, part of what I do is run the United Religious Community, which is an interfaith organization serving greater St. Joe County in a variety of ways. And I'm glad to be a part of the panel tonight with such great other folks.
Great, great.
Greetings, my name is Charlie Pine. In the midst of transitioning back to the US after more than 20 years of living in China, engaging with mainstream secular Chinese and Muslim ethnic minority groups, I was honored to come and spend a year at Notre Dame as a fellow in the Inspired Leadership Initiative, where I've continued to explore themes related to Muslim Christian peacemaking work.
Great.
So delighted to be with you all.
Welcome.
Hello, my name is Mana Derakshani, and you didn't mess it up too badly.
Thank you.
I am, so I work at St. Mary's College as the director of the Center for Women's Intercultural Leadership, and I'm a member of the Baha'i community here in town. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation tonight.
Great. So the place that I want us to start is with this idea of religious narratives and racial narratives and how they create or constrain space for full flourishing. And I wonder, for those of you who are just watching, and the panelists here, what you don't know is that they have no idea of the questions that are coming. And so if they're starting to kind of roll their heads back and look off into the distances because I'm inviting questions that they have not yet had the opportunity to think about, and I'm asking them to be kind of mentally agile and vulnerable at the same time. And so they are brave, courageous souls, and I appreciate their work with us today. So here we go. Religious or racial narratives, or even the combination of the two, where in your own life have you seen those narratives as creating a certain set of constraints on who you might be, who you could be, what it is that you think, do, relate to, believe, anything like that? Are there ways that you can point to notice how these religious or racialized narratives create constraints to your full flourish in any small or large way?
Well, I'll take a shot at it. I would say, growing up in a time, so I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and that was a time in a lot of change in the Catholic Church about being more open to the idea of engaging with other faith traditions. And so I remember thinking, oh, I didn't know this was a sort of a box around it, like, you're in the church and everything that's not in that side of things, you don't really need to know about too much because we have the answers here. I believe that narrative has changed quite a bit, and that examples like what we're doing tonight, sponsored through a Catholic university with a variety of people from many different faith traditions, and Catholics probably across quite a spectrum of things, has changed with that some. But that, I think, would be one of the ahas, is that when you start seeing the other side of the fence, you didn't even know it was over there. So, and in a way, a church or any religious tradition that says we have the answers all within here, you don't need to look out there, probably prevents you from knowing, if nothing else, knowing people from many of those other places.
That's really helpful. And so one of the things that these narratives do is they tell you, they guide you as to where to look for meaningful sources of knowledge, right? Like there are certain places where knowledge is valuable, acceptable, valid, ex cathedra, and then there are certain places where this knowledge is not. And so it shapes your entire epistemology. And then you don't know what else you don't know, because you don't even know what questions to ask or not to ask when you're happily ensconced inside of a particular narrative frame. So that's a really helpful start. I wonder what else people could think of.
Well, picking up on what John started to talk about too, I grew up as a cradle Catholic, and I lived here in South Bend. I was born and raised in South Bend, but I didn't live here my whole life. I left in just about 1960, 59, and I didn't come back for 40 years. So I've just been back now. My second term around was 20 years ago. I came back. So long story short on that one. But anyway, and I've been a lifelong Catholic. I mean, up to this point, and I tend to keep it that way. I married someone who was Jewish, my husband, and my late husband. And so that kind of made a difference. It didn't make a difference so much as that it really, I think, enriched both my faith and his faith in terms of it, because we maintained our religious affiliation before that. I think what makes a difference, though, in terms of the race issue, is that where that takes place. I mean, I was not really aware of any differences when I was growing up. Of course, that was a while ago, and the 40s and the 50s certainly. And so, I mean, and I was a young person, of course, at that time. And so I think that's different. But when I moved to Chicago in 59, of course, it was just at the cusp of when all the 60s were coming along, and I became much more aware of the differences and the narrative of that. And of course, there's a larger population and more diversity than there would be here in South Bend at the time. Although there were some African American people there here too. But that's the only thing. I think, well, that's enough for now. Anyway.
Okay. All right. All right.
I find that question difficult to answer.
Because
Because from the point of view of my faith tradition and the way I was taught to view the world, it was extremely inclusive and, embracing all, the Baha'i faith encourages fellowship with people from all faith traditions, the principle of, the oneness of humanity, the elimination of all prejudices. So in terms of what I was taught formally, the narrative, as it were, was one of inclusivity and acceptance and openness. However, theory is not reality. And ideals and the principles of my faith are wonderful and open, and as I mentioned, all inclusive. However, people who live in that faith tradition, who have accepted it wholeheartedly and strive to live based on those principles, also live in this society and have been infected, so to speak, by the biases and the prejudices that exist in the cultural narrative around us. And so, yes, I witnessed and was probably myself, culpable of all kinds of biases and racist actions and prejudices, but that was always kind of the behavior of the people, not the story we were told or the narrative that we were supposed to follow. You understand what I'm saying? Like people are imperfect and liable to be affected by everything that's around us. Like we don't live in that ideal society.
Yeah, and narrative is what you live. It's how it's so there's both what you're told, but there's also narrative shapes your performative. And so the narrative that you're living in and living out shapes your behavior. And often, so you say where, people are impacted by kind of the culture. So the idea though is that the narrative that you're performing, I can watch your performance and read and analyze and see what that narrative actually is. Now, somebody else may notice a gap between the pure theory, the teachings, and the behavior, and that creates space for disappointment, for surprise, for judgment, where their narrative is different from the narrative that you're living, right? From the narrative of the facts that are on the ground. But the behaviors and the symbols and the ways of speaking and being, they betray the narrative that you're actually living into. So there may be differences between what's pure in theory and the narratives that people adopt.
Right, right. And within, my experience in my family and in the Baha'i community, I think sometimes we achieve that ideal inclusiveness and openness, and sometimes we don't.
Yeah.
Because like I
Yeah.
said, we're human
Right.
and and we
Right.
are subject to all kinds of like, influences.
Yeah.
Right.
We all fall short of the ideals that have been crafted and
Right.
given for us. Yeah. Charlie, what do you got? What are you thinking?
I really am intrigued by, you use the word space. And whether I like how you framed the question of, is that an expansive space? I mean, do we have narratives that encourage an expansiveness or a restrictiveness to that space? And I guess it got me thinking about a little bit about my life journey. And I think about, for me, early life experiences, I would kind of at the intersection of these questions, I would say were very much framed in the sense of a very isolated experience, very limited contact with people from other religions, other races. And so I joke with my adult children at times saying, I feel like I grew up as a little bit of a poster child for monoculturalism. And then later, beginning in my university years, that began to shift in very profound ways. And it was over the course of 4 years of university, I made the extreme life-altering decision to set out on a career trajectory in China. And the whole world opened, and my adult kids who grew up in China laughed, thinking, how could our very multicultural father have ever been a monocultural American? But I think this question that you're posing is really intriguing to me, because I think that initial transition for me actually operated with I think the language you used of maximizing flourishing. I see now where I'm at in the journey. Another very restrictive element is that what initially launched me from isolation to engagement with those that were different, still it took place in a narrative framework where it was not about mutuality and learning. It actually became framed of, and I've just, even in the last week or two, there's 2 words that I've encountered in a couple of different contexts. One has been the word outreach in certain religious circles, and the other has been the idea of service. And I think both of these words are very intriguing to me, that they carry this, they're functional in a narrative framework that has these embedded assumptions of outreach. I will go to the other, but it's to bring them something of value, to improve their lives, with the assumption I have what they need for their improvement. And even this idea of service, which is generally presented in a very positive light. We, the University of Notre Dame, we want to encourage a spirit of service among the students, and we want people to serve. And yet I'm just increasingly aware that the narrative behind that is still, I think last week, David, you made the comment about distinctions are not necessarily bad, but when they're in a hierarchical fashion, that's where they become problematic. And I think this language of outreach service that was very formative for me, breaking from isolation to engagement, but it still had these embedded assumptions of I'm going to help. And so it perpetuated these assumptions that I have what other people need in this one directional way. And so in more recent years, just an awareness, and I think this idea again of what is truly expansive is how do I shift to this idea of mutuality, that my engagement is not what I can bring to the other, how I can improve things for the other, but another level of transition for me has been, how can I sincerely learn from the other
Mm.
in a real spirit of mutuality? And to me, that becomes the heartbeat of, I think I love that word you use, of just flourishing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
How can there be genuine flourishing when there's a true spirit of mutuality? I'm not reaching out because of what I think I have to bring of benefit to the other, but to really learn from.
So I wonder, Charlie, that's helpful. And my question in some way jumps from what you just said, or it kind of is touching on a piece of what you just said. I wonder if, because each of you has kind of mentioned having been in a particular space. Monty, you might not have said it exactly this way, but being in a particular space and then um, at least John and June, you were kind of in a contained space, and then at some point, you got to notice a broader set of ideas, the existence of a world outside of the world that had been constructed for you. Mana, I actually think this relates to you very much as well, but maybe in the inverse, which is always helpful to see in the inverse. Are so the question is, we're trying to figure out what's on the other side. Like what allowed you to see that there was another side, another narrative, and how, if at all, were you able to give that other narrative validity? This is the question, because sometimes you see that there is another way of being distinctly different from yours, and it's hard to give that other narrative trajectory the same level of validity that you give yours. I'm wondering if you have that. And so I actually think yours is in the inverse.
It is. And I was actually going to say that I have, my experience has always been being outside of that wall, like being the other, looking in. And when you are the other, you generally are very much aware of
Mhm.
of the main story. You're very much aware of, you know, what it is that you're the other for. However, I thought of something as you were talking, David, which made me think of, yeah. So in terms of gender,
Mhm.
I could relate to what you were talking about as a woman, because I grew up as an only child, did not have brothers, did
Mhm.
not have male cousins necessarily. And really my worldview was one of a woman. I was raised by women, mainly. And so that kind of understanding that there was another way of looking at the world happened when I first became friends with men in
Mhm.
college. And then when I got married, even more, you know, even
Mhm.
more opening into there is another way of looking at the world, that is not necessarily the way I look at the world, and is not necessarily wrong, right? Um, so
Yeah, yeah. And I want to come back to that. I'm wondering, like, June, John, if you all, from the space that you were, the particularly as you talked about kind of the Catholic spaces, not even necessarily knowing, like, there's the church and then there's everybody else that does something, right? I grew up in this thing, or June, I grew up in this world, and I didn't quite recognize, even though there were Black and brown bodied folks in my in the town, I didn't necessarily know of their existence to a great extent. I mean, there's a surface awareness, but not a depth awareness of it. So I'm wondering what allowed you to become aware of outside of your narrative, and then in what ways did you struggle, or were you able to give that other narrative the same validity that was that you had for your own?
I think probably, first of all, when I was growing up, I went to a Catholic school, grade school,
Mm-hmm.
and it was boys and girls, but there were no Black students
Mm-hmm.
in it.
Mm-hmm.
I was aware, even as as I was growing up, we'd go downtown to South Bend. Then we used to take a streetcar to go down to town. But uh, anyway, I mean, I was aware, and it was, in a sense, it was always the West Side where mainly the Black people lived, and that was true. That you know, immigrating generations had come through that way, and the wave of Black people that came from the South, in the
Mm-hmm.
40s, and mainly attracted by Studebaker and the plants that were here, the industrial plants during the war. Well, anyway, but it wasn't really as a child in my consciousness as anything. There was no difference really. I mean, there were other people, and we were obviously we were white, but I didn't think about that, even though being Catholic. I think the real awareness came when I did go to Chicago, when I went with purpose, because I had a job that I was going to be having there, and I was excited about that. And so when I went there, as I got to know Chicago a little bit better, I had visited, of course, day trips in and out as a kid, going in and out with my parents or my mom. Um, and I think I was at one point, it was probably the first year that I was there in the 60s. I was going down State Street, and there was a Kresge's there,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and I looked in, and I saw no people of color there, but I did see, I mean, there was just a regular thing. And I guess I came back to where I was working, and I mentioned something about that. They said,
Mm-hmm.
oh, that, Black people don't go there because they're not allowed. And so that was a shock, because I mean, and then I recall, going downtown in South Bend, which, and there were shops and there were restaurants and things. And I don't remember that people were excluded ever. I never remember seeing anything like that. And they may very well have been. I don't know. I mean, but it was shocking for me anyway. So that was the kind of the first realization.
Mm-hmm.
And later in the 60s, I had changed places. I went to work at WGN. And before that, I was at WGN. That was my entry job. And I moved over to CBS, to WSBT,
Mm-hmm.
or not WSBT, but WBBM TV in Chicago. And at the end of that, I was producing programs for public affairs and children. And I was tapped by the Board of Education to help them produce or to produce with their staff a series of Black history shows for high school students primarily, but they were going to be broadcast on open circuit. And of course, Chicago had one of the first cable systems that were wired for video in the system throughout for all the high schools. So that was my challenge there. So that was really, I mean, it was an opportunity, and it was early television, of course, and also early in this, because there was a need for it. So that was really the experience, and the experience of working with a team of 3 African-American high school teachers and 1 white teacher also involved in that, and me coming in. So essentially, it was a blending of, the skills that I had, which were the production skills for putting something like that together, and they're bringing the expertise and I'm kind of leading the way to how do you put it together, how you script something like that, or how do you do it. So it was a challenge, So it was really, but it was. They were very gracious, and I think we got along very well. I mean, we go get soul food on the south side, and it was great, So it was a good experience all the way around, and it was, I hope it did some good. I don't know the word that we did. Yeah.
So, John, when you discovered that there were others, that they're outside, that there was something outside of the kind of Catholic enclave, when you were developing, coming an awareness of that other, what were the other, what was this other, and how, if at all, and it may not have been, it may have been a gradual thing, but how, if at all, were you able to engage and come to know those stories and hold them as equally valid with your own?
I appreciated Gene's thought there. It gave me a chance to think through that. So I think it was three things. All right. One was the Catholic Church itself, institutionally, was changing quite a bit. Uh, in those days, it was a little more open. The mass changed, and those, so
Right.
going to the ritual every Sunday got very different very fast. And I was young, so it didn't make a whole lot of difference to me. But I know it was hard on some older folks and very enlightening, exciting for others. So that was one thing. Two, I think, and it relates to two parts, but that there was good leadership, good intentional. We're going to place you. We're going to. My mom was part of that. She dragged us around to everything. And at that time, I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, which is just north of Chicago, and it was at a time very close to the Baha'i Temple. In fact, we could ride our bikes over there.
Oh, it is.
And but it was a time there was an awful lot of changes going there on desegregation, on legalized, ending legalized restrictions on where people could live and all. And so that was all happening. And that was, we would go to marches, and a lot of that was happening in Black churches in Evanston. And so that the things that we were seeing in the community were not being reflected and talked about in the way that was satisfying to folks who wanted the church to have more to say about this. And then the third, I sort of bombed out of Catholic schools in second grade somehow or other, and I wound up going to public school, and that was a huge part of it. There was a lot of intentionality around integrating schools and trying to model things, and so it was at a perfect time for me. So I was lucky. It was at a good age for me to absorb those things.
The question is still, I'm pressing this.
Okay.
How, if at all, do you come to experience the story of the other as equally valid with yours? Like, it's fascinating to go on the South Side and eat soul food, but does that create a experience of an equally valid like narrative, so that there's no hierarchy? It's fascinating to be in an outreach and service position in China among a variety of different people, but at what point, what's the necessary piece? It's fascinating to be other, to be Baha'i in some ways outside of the the general understand, the way that the dominant narrative has constructed society. What allows you to hear the other narrative as equally valid?
I think the only way that that happens is through personal relationships. It's encountering another person as equal to yourself, establishing some intimate,
Encountering them as equal, like
like
what?
establishing friendships,
Okay.
right? Like establishing a friendship
Mhm.
with someone who is in that other group and hearing their stories and understanding them as, you know, actors of their narrative in the way that you are of your own, and that validates that narrative. I mean,
Well, yes and no. I mean, too many people have this experience and it doesn't validate it. It actually does it
within a friendship,
reaffirms.
within a real friendship,
Well,
Relationship, I think,
yeah,
Yeah.
relationship.
maybe not as.
well, it depends on the relationship, right? If your relationship is hierarchical, then that wouldn't happen, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm thinking of my very first, so I grew up in Morocco, and which is a whole other story of
Mhm.
being a Baha'i in a predominantly Muslim country. But
Mhm.
my first Moroccan friend I remember was in gosh, 6th or 7th grade. And it was the first time I actually yeah, I mean, I had a friendship with a Moroccan girl of my age, and I heard her talk about her family, and she listened to the way I was talking to about my family, and we shared our lived experiences through a, you know,
Mhm.
mutually listening to each other's narratives.
Mhm. Yeah.
Mhm.
There may actually be, June, I'm coming. There may be another way to get at this question. There may be a slightly different way to approach this question if I come around from the back end of it. Do you have a friend, someone, someone that you know that was kind of formed in the same cultural context that you were, that finds some of your expansiveness, some of your willingness to engage the other as problematic?
Are you opening that to everybody?
I just opened it back up. Yeah, yeah. I'm see.
I was hoping Mana would answer that.
Yeah, yeah.
I can't think of anyone, so I'm thinking,
Okay, okay.
but others, like, yeah.
Hmm. I think, yeah, if I think about it, that I could probably identify folks who think I've gone too far, or did you lose sight of things? And I'm thinking that in the sort of the religious practice kind of context.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I could probably say yes to that.
Yeah. June, you had a hand up before and I cut you off. I didn't
Yeah.
let you get back in. So.
Well, I just wanted just to say, you know, what I experienced in Chicago was a working relationship, but it became, these people became my friends as well, these men that were teachers. And we had some commonality in terms of how we produced this program, because we would go to set up production at a Black church and have that. And so you need to meet those people, the people that were the choir and the people in charge of the church, of course, and all that kind of thing. And then we would have interviews. We had Jesse Jackson, was one of the persons that was involved with the church type of experience that we had. So there were a lot of opportunities for me to be the different person in it, but yet the comfort level was good. I mean, even though there certainly were, I was not unaware of racial tensions in the city of Chicago, for sure. Quickly you became aware of that. But I think that it was as far as my background as a Catholic, it's just, those were my values, and that's the way I would always be treating people, no matter what. That I was open for that. Didn't make a difference if they weren't Catholic or if they were. I would be open to that relationship, and hopefully, as it turned out, so were these people that I was working with. So that was. It was a good experience all the way around. And of course, the opportunities to see and to meet Margaret Burroughs when she first started her museum. And that was, a thrill to know all that. I was very aware of the art scene and the things that were going on. So it was nice to see that too. And we kept in touch after the project. So that was good. The people that I had worked with at the board.
So let me change the facts ever so slightly on this question. We're going somewhere. Trust me, we are going somewhere. I'm sneaking up on it. Hello, who is our fifth panelist?
That's my security detail.
Oh, yeah.
I like it. All right,
Yeah.
welcome.
Yeah.
Have any of you ever had the experience of having a friend who is from another cultural context of some sort, a cross-border friendship, cross-boundary friendship of some sort, and you've had friends or family who find that relationship problematic?
Can't think of any. It's interesting.
I cannot believe.
There must be, but I can't think of any.
Wow, this is an amazing life you've lived. Well,
For me, David, I think, again, this word that you use of space. And so we've got kind of space and relationships, and part of my story journey as I began doing ethnographic work in China among Muslims. I remember coming to my advisor in my first year on this ethnographic project, and I remember posing the question. So this was a Chinese Muslim scholar I was studying under. I remember asking him, would it be appropriate for you to teach me how to join in Muslim prayers in the mosque? And his response was very interesting. He actually said, oh, if you want to understand about the prayers, you're always welcome to come to the mosque, sit at the back, and observe. When I got that as an initial answer, I had to make a decision on, I realized there was a little bit of a dilemma here. I thought, it's possible that he didn't fully understand my question, which my question was, could I participate, not sit in the back and observe? And I thought, it's possible he didn't fully understand the intent, in which case a follow-up question to clarify would be very appropriate. It's also possible that he fully understood the question, and without giving me a negative answer, he twisted it in a positive fashion to say, what you're proposing, no, would not be appropriate, but this would be an acceptable alternative. Not knowing that, I risked going ahead and posing the follow-up question. And I still to this day don't fully know if I just kind of pushed the boundary hard enough. But long story short, I was invited into that world. I was invited to learn kind of the routine, the postures of Muslim prayers. So to your question, my choosing to do that absolutely raises profound questions for many people of my own faith background, Christian circles. And it even, it creates dilemmas for many of my Muslim friends. You haven't converted, you haven't become Muslim.
Right.
What are you doing here in this space?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think my experience has been very much what you're talking about. You know, the friends, the way I speak of those friends in affirming terms. Again, back to my initial comment, you know, I have loads of people that, you know, if this is a strategy for religious conversion, then I have people like a huge cheerleading squad, like, yeah, Charlie, more of that. But when I start to unpack for them, like, no, that's what's been deconstructed for me, is that I actually am doing this out of this mutual learning, in engaging in a different way than what I had previously understood. Then yes, it becomes problematic. And the real challenge, I think, David, as you start posing these questions, I've heard it said, and this I think is the power of some of these narratives, is in community, when you start to take these steps that you're exploring, yeah, the communities that we belong to, you run the risk of getting rejected from your own communities because you've stepped out, you've embraced new ways of thinking. It's very easy to get stuck in this no man's land because, you know, the new communities, you're not becoming the other, but you're engaging with the other. So you're not fully received in this new community. You run the risk of getting kicked out of your original old community. And yeah, and this language, yeah, we want to be flourishing, and yet you can find yourself floundering with, where do I fit? Where do I belong? And so there are very real risks in the journey.
Yeah, the operating, still fully operating in one narrative, one faith narrative, in this instance, Christianity, but having a performance, I would say, not even a performative, but a performance, social performance in another set of faith rituals and practices and beliefs. It's interesting to hold those two together and to wonder and imagine, am I holding these with equal validity, or is one expressive of who I am and the participation in the other an example of what makes me good in this realm? What makes me good in the Christian realm is my willingness to join in the kind of ritual performances, not necessarily the belief system, but the ritual performances of another system, right? Like, I don't know where that narrative, how you sort those, or whether you do, or whether you even need to. You know, there's maybe not a binary construction in that. It's tending towards, maybe you're tending towards Baha'i-ness in the sense that you are practicing how to to completely appreciate, with no hierarchy, all the different kind of traditions or whatever like that. I don't know. I don't know enough about Baha'i-ness to know, other than to know that there's no separation or, you know, hierarchy or hate or anything like that. What I was trying to find for you were examples of where and how you all have used or created counter narratives to, if you've engaged someone who is operating in a narrative that impedes your full flourishing, even impedes what you imagined is it impedes their own full flourishing. Like, how, if at all, are you utilizing counter narratives? How have you created something else that you can, because the everyday practice of counter narrative strategies becomes really important, even when you're trying to be in relationships, mutual relationships with others, because that's not like an easy thing necessarily to do. That takes a certain kind of work and a recreation of a space in which you can have a shared space, not one or the other. You don't have to compromise or do what a lot of like interreligious dialogues do, which is to only focus on the common denominator and not the full consideration of all of the bounds. So I'm just wondering, I was trying to sneak up on this notion of counter narrative strategies, but you all were resisting my request, my impulse.
Can I throw in something? Because I feel a little boring that maybe I couldn't come up with an example. But I would say that I have observed and been a close observer frequently and more frequently of late to good friends or family members who themselves have had to deal with these kinds of questions, particularly in a church setting around homosexuality, for example, gender identity, and what the official church teachings are versus what we might feel it is to be a person of faith and compassionate. And that whole notion of, I mean, if you take the idea of flourishing and wishing to flourish, I love that word. I think of that as vocation, to really helping yourself, but also others to figure out what is that God-given place that has been set for this person. That's not, shouldn't just be a vice of fancy people. That should be our goal in life for others. But then if our constraints around, well, you can't be that identity, or you can't date that person, or you can't, whatever your church might teach, or your racial identity might encourage and all. So I see that happening more and more. And then that's a true challenge on faith, and a good one, I think, for us to face. So.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that this is the thing. I think that there are components of almost every faith or religious narrative that have the possibility, they can be crafted in ways that create inclusive spaces and equitable regard and so forth. And those same sources can be reordered in ways that create very narrow and constraining interpretations and limit what's possible for people, limit what they know, limit the value of information outside of what the narrative orthodoxy is of the particular faith, limit what are acceptable relationships, where and how you use your resources, who you give testimonial authority to, like who is it that you would even listen to or hear as you think about your interpretation of what's proper in society. So there are ways in which these narratives can be both opening and constraining. And we're in the midst of severe contestation all around the world about which of these narratives are, or the breadth of narrative that will be given full reign, will allow to have dominance. And so right now, in the United States, in Myanmar, in Ethiopia, in any number of places, the narratives of religion and race are narrowing in ways that cut off access to the full civil sphere for people who don't exist neatly inside of those dominant narratives. And so the idea that we started with, the idea of creating new stories of race and religion. And we've talked mostly about religion, but I wouldn't want us to go away without at least saying something about race, because there are ways in which unconsciously we often racialize ourselves. And we know there are things that we can do, and we know that there are things that we can't do because we assign ways of being, ways of thinking to other racial categories. And because even though race is a fiction, we've constructed boundaries for our being. And so the same way that religion creates our narratives around race create constraints in who and how we can be in the world. And so, the goal is to figure out how to construct broader or different narratives or post-religious, post-racial. And when I say post, I don't mean after. Like a lot of times people say it means after, but it just means when those things are decentered, when, the religious narratives and the racial narratives aren't at the center of the construction of the civil sphere. Is that possible? Right? If you can't create them broad enough so that everybody has the equitable access to the relationships, resources, structures, testimonial authority that they need to survive, to thrive, to make a full contribution to a greater good. If you can't create that, can you create post-religious, post-racial constructions of civil sphere so that people can flourish? At the end of the day, people achieving their full capabilities and that's a personal thing. That's not like it's the truth. It's just vocation. The way that I hold it is like, that's what we're here for, is for ourselves and to create space for others to fully flourish and to realize their gifts. And so that's what all these questions are about.
Mhm.
How, if at all, do your racial identities constrain you?
For me, I would say it's heavily a question of risk taking. To that it, I feel it needs to be intentional on my part to try to get to know people that are different than me, and that takes energy and risk and time and commitment, so that it's not trivial or one time or a checkbox or something like that. And so I don't know. I would say it's my racial identity that does that, but also just my life and where I am at this point as well.
Sure.
And that it for me it's important that it be part of what I want to do, that flourishing idea, so that when you take those risks, when I take that risk, generally speaking, I'm rewarded for it in flourishing and getting to know other people and all. But it's still an effort and something to overcome.
I really like, John, that idea of risk taking, to lean into things that would take us beyond in an expansive fashion. I really appreciate that.
I find that is true for me as an introvert. It is true for reaching out to any relationship, but there are maybe additional barriers having to do with not just race, but also level of education, or just the circles that I run into generally that are comfortable, because that's what I've always done. I agree with Charlie, and that I really appreciate the notion of risk, because it is a risk. Yeah, you take a risk when you step out of that comfort zone, and it's a very rewarding thing to do. But you have to overcome your
Sometimes.
own obstacles.
Mhm. June, you had your hand.
Well, I think in terms of, I guess in my own situation, the biggest risk that I had to take was because I was a woman, and I was entering a place where it was male dominated.
Yep.
And it took a long time for me to get even to the level, which wasn't that great, but I mean, just even to get there. I started out as a secretary. Not that there's anything wrong with being a good secretary, but I always looked for an opportunity to try to find places that I wanted to um, learn more about. And of course, television was new then, so that was a good opportunity to get in on the ground floor.
Mhm.
In fact, that was my brush with Notre Dame. I started at WNDU TV
Mhm.
as a traffic manager at the time. But so, I mean, that was, straight out of, my early 20s, that I did that. So those things. And then I think that having gone through that kind of thing today, looking back at that and over the years, even, how do you create opportunity for people who are different skin color than I,
Mhm.
or to do something like that? Even at that time, there weren't any opportunities, but,
Mhm.
we were women and minority people were in the same boat, essentially. We didn't have that much of a leg up. So, I think, you kind of had to, you can appreciate the battle of
Mhm.
the other,
Yeah.
Yes, it was an advantage to be white. Yes,
Mhm. Mhm.
I didn't think of myself as better. I really didn't. But, there was the way you were brought up, so,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So, Mana, I want to ask you to do something. Um, Having lived a life as the other, what is something or what are some things that you would have wished or you would hope that people who were in dominant spaces would know to do to create spaces for the other? Is that
I,
a fair question, Sarah?
it is. In fact, I was thinking back to what I said earlier about my friendship with um, that girl back
Uh-huh.
in 6th grade. And it seems to me that she was the one who had to create a counter narrative
Mhm.
um, to allow me into her life.
Mhm.
And I don't know how
Mhm.
her parents dealt with the fact that she was friends with, a girl who was not Muslim, not Moroccan. And I don't know. We never talked about it. So to answer your question, I think what I would wish is for everyone really to be um, willing to open up non-judgmentally, being able to withhold judgment when they encounter the other. Um, that seems essential. Uh,
Mhm.
and just to ask ask good questions
Mhm.
with sincerity,
Mhm.
with openness, and be willing to listen, right? I've never resented people asking me questions about who I am or what I believe in or where I come from. What I resent is when people make assumptions
Mhm.
and don't ask the questions.
Mhm.
So
So, asking questions, taking risks, being non judgmental, recognizing that the narratives that we've been given may have been given to us in love from an earlier phase in the lives of those who were forming us. And so we always have the opportunity to expand, to learn others. and then to practice the idea of holding narratives that are different equally valid. Like, is it possible that this is an equally valid way of thinking and being? And then how do I create spaces of compassion, spaces of inclusion, of how do I create relationships that are that create spaces that can be shared so that we can each thrive, survive, thrive, flourish, and contribute back to a greater good. We know that narratives have a way of constraining sometimes our epistemology, our relationships, but it's not necessarily so. And so anytime you see or hear or experience someone operating inside of a narrative that limits or constrains them, it's an opportunity to practice counter narrative strategies, to build new narratives, new story. And then they can tell, even if not full narratives, they can at least tell a new story about religion or race that might seed the possibility of expanding narratives. I really appreciate you all being our last panel for the session together. This has been fun for me. I was supposed to leave 2 minutes for Mahan to come back on. I hope that he will join us and take center stage to wrap us up. But I think I have left you with exactly the 2 minutes requested.
Yes, thank you. You did. I think what I'm hearing, I'm just supposed to give a formal conclusion, and I've want to be careful not to venture into just last minute participant. Is what's required is genuine engagement, where you take risks, you're vulnerable, you truly listen. And you're not scripted where you're trying to determine an outcome, but you're willing to be transformed along the way. And so I have a quick story. When the question you asked, Professor Hooker, David, about, an example of when, your narrative changed and it brought you into conflict with someone before. I was part of a group very quickly, and I came into academia because they wanted me to translate the ideas of that group into philosophical language. And I'm like, I got this. And I came in and I started engaging academically. And I said, wait a minute, there's more that we need to think about internally. And as I went back with that, they said, you're getting corrupted. I said, no, I'm learning. And so that's kind of put me in no man's land, but I continue on this journey. And I want to thank you, David, and everyone who's participated, for taking us through this, imagining new stories of race and religion. We are in the midst of severe contestation around the world. We need new narratives. It reminds me of Martin Luther King Jr.'s book, the last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And the last chapter of that book, he begins by, this example of a wildly dispersed family has inherited a house and they have to figure out how to live together. And that's a metaphor for humanity today. And so I feel like this kind of room and what you inspired here was kind of modeled that kind of engagement, agonizing, soul searching engagement that we need. So we want to thank you for this. Professor David Hooker is a professor at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And you can learn more about him and I'm sure come to lectures that he offers on campus in the future. This forum here is an experiment. It's like a coffee house. We're online because of the pandemic. We wanted to do this live and build a community. Ansari Institute is about global engagement with religion, but what's global begins locally. The local is also global. And we want to continue to do this. We invite you to stay tuned. If you're not already on our email list, please do sign up. Ask your friends to sign up. We routinely send announcements there, updated events, and occasionally even post conversations that don't take place live, but are pre-recorded. And you can see some of those also on our website. It's ansari.nd.edu. We want to expand this circle. And if you have ideas on the kinds of things that would benefit the community and you want to participate more, please do email us and be in touch. What's coming up next? Next week, we're going to publish a conversation that I had with Dr. Yeheskel Landau. He's an Israeli citizen and an American citizen. And we're calling it On the Altar of Peace. And it really follows up nicely to what we did here in this class with Professor Hooker, where it's about the need to hold multiple narratives. In the case of Israel-Palestine, at least two narratives simultaneously as a starting point for any hope for peace and reconciliation. And you get a sense of what the title means if you tune into that conversation. On Monday, we're having a conversation with an intergenerational conversation with Reverend Jeremiah Wright and a young scholar who's a Wright scholar on the crises of our time. So please join us for that conversation. And once again, thank you all for participating. I feel I'm getting to know many of you, and we look forward to being with you again at the next opportunity.